Then, well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to the second session of Topoi Theory in Practice. We are going to begin with Martin Jordan's paper, Eccentric Dances in the Music of Boundary Past, the Evolution of a Musical Topic.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you all for coming. The title is a bit grandiose because I haven't yet established the eccentric dances as a musical topic, and I'm already talking about their evolution, but please forgive me that. If you have not heard of Pavel Haas, he was a Czech, or more specifically a Moravian composer. So you can see the arrow pointing to Brno, which is like the Moravian city. He was the brother of Hugo Haas, who was quite a popular actor in the interwar period in Czech movies. He was also the student of Leoš Janáček, who is the person on the right. So, and he is known as one of the Theresienstadt composers because he was sadly imprisoned in Theresienstadt in the 1940s and ultimately killed in Auschwitz. So that is the brief biography, and I'm going to skip to the 1920s to the premiere of one of his major works, which was a string quartet with a rather strange title, From the Monkey Mountains. And I'm just going to play two examples to give you a gist of the character of this music. So this was part of the second movement, Carriage, Horseman, and Horse, with this programmatic title, if you will. And one more example from the last movement called The Wild Night. Did I mention it was a string quartet? So what does the percussions do in there? I don't know. Actually, well, I do, but you don't know yet. Haas published this innocent sounding program that the piece was inspired by several strong impressions from a light-hearted summer vacation in the country. Fair enough. But there are clearly some subversive elements. I mean, string quartet is supposed to be high art, and it's contaminated here by low art and jazz and percussions. It's supposed to be serious, and yet it's caricature-like, it's grotesque. And it includes this percussion set, which confusingly was called the jazz band in the 1920s. So what was Haas thinking? I'm arguing that the Wild Night, the last movement, is actually the first of Haas's so-called eccentric dances, which became an important topic in his in his music. So the contemporary critics complained that there were undesirable modern Western influences, that it was fashionable to use the percussion set, it was tasteless to use this element of caricature. There was some cheap imitation of Honegger, which I wanted to omit from our presentation, but I won't, given the link to our previous discussion this morning. So some even commented that it was dishonest for Haas to claim that it was inspired by a vacation in the country, because the atmosphere of the last movement was decidedly urban and bar-like, which I think is fair. Now, in modern scholarship, Lubomír Peduci argued that Haas, without denying the influence of Janáček, sought inspiration in the music of Lesis and Igor Stravinsky, and that was the way of positioning Haas's music in the history of 20th century music, which is somewhat reductive. I mean, Haas did know some Stravinsky, and he probably knew some Lesis, but what was the influence of Czech avant-garde is my question. The other question is, if eccentric dance is to be regarded as a topic, which is my hypothesis, what are the signifiers? And what did I signify? What is the signified? And does the signified change over the course of Haas's career from the mid-1920s to the mid-1940s? And I have like 18 minutes to cover that. So you need to know about poetism, which is the dominant ism in Czech avant-garde of the 1920s. And it was associated with the Devětsil society, which was a Prague-based society around people like Karel Tajge and Vítězslav Nezval. It was heavily influenced by Parisian avant-garde and Russian avant-garde and all sorts of international avant-gardes at the time. It was formulated in two manifestos by Tajge called Poetism and the Manifesto of Poetism. So what was it about? Well, the old versus the new. The old was bourgeois culture. It was isolated from everyday life. It was elitist. It was transcendent. It was blah, blah, blah. So we saw the socialist art, which was merged with everyday life, which was accessible to the masses, which was earthly. So it should be inspired by jazz, cinema, cabaret, circus, the fairground, and all sorts of things like that. You hear the echo of Jean Cocteau and his Cock and Harlequin. I mentioned the link to the body and sensuality. I mean, rhythm was important because it was the correlative of bodily motion in music. That's why jazz was important, because of its rhythmic vitality. It was linked to these Negro stereotypes, like having rhythm in the demisemic quavers, leading to this ultimate collapse or going out of control, if you will, which I think is part of this caricature-like scenario taking place in this movement. The machine kind of spinning out of control and then coming to a grinding halt, perhaps. So that's not directly perhaps relevant to the theme of eccentric dances, but I just wanted to play that example. What's important is a kind of Bakhtinian tone, which Taige's writing get on poetism. Taige writes that poetism wants to turn life into a spectacular, entertaining affair, an eccentric carnival, very important term, a harlequinade of sensations and fantasies, a delirious film sequence, and a miraculous kaleidoscope. Poetism was born in a world which laughs. What does it matter if there are tears in its eyes? So there are these principles of the counterculture of laughter with which poetism is identified. And I should also add that poetism was conceived as a counterpart of constructivism in Taige's thought. So there was this dialectical process of constructivist and playful poetivist aesthetics. I'm not going further into Bakhtin. I want to show you some arguments why we should actually associate Haas with poetism. So this Devětsil group, which was active in Prague, had its branch in Brno briefly in the 1920s. And they organized, now we have to, I'm sorry. They organized these eccentric 8 o'clocks of artists, and fashionably they actually called them 8 o'clocks in the Czech newspapers. And they culminated in an eccentric carnival of artists. Now the theme of carnival gets some real contours. And there was a poem called Carnival, created by someone called Dalibor Chalupa, which originated as an introductory speech to this event. And this poem was set to music by Haas. And I think that some of the topics that appear here are quite important for the movement from the string quartet I played to you. So you can see all these yellow, like music-like stage directions, which mention the jazz band several times, actually. So it's about bellowing and jazz band and racket and gunshots. Also, there's this carnivalesque image of a gondola sailing through an opium dream and the earth flowing away and dancing through the space, a sort of dance eccentric. I think it's rather important that Haas called the third movement of his wind quintet ballo eccentrico, which is literally dance eccentric or eccentric dance. Interestingly, there is also a sort of troping of this idea of eccentric dance with the dance of death. And this is actually a line which has crossed out in the setting of his male choir and replaced with the line, a skeleton dancer treads on tiptoes. So he's linking this carnivalesque dance eccentric with more macabre, dance macabre. So this is a couple of motifs which appear in the setting of this poem called Carnival. And it goes like, the text is 4 left legs in a red-green spiral, which appears later on in Ballo Eccentrico from his wind quintet. So these are clear references to this thing. And I argue that before this time, already in 1925, The Wild Night from this reported from the Monkey Mountains is actually a proto-example of eccentric dances. And it sounds like this. And I believe there's some exoticism to this theme, which is pentatonic, which is built on fourths. It's angular. It's major, minor, ambivalent. It's got some cross rhythms, which create this idea of awkward motion. That's one kind of dance. And then comes a sort of perhaps primitivist Janacekian folk-like dance. These augmented intervals. And then a reference to polka, which sounds rather banal. I would argue that there's an excess of redundant elements like fillings and accompaniment patterns. And this dance, which is already like a composition of different dances, comes to kind of frantic culmination. Again, it goes through progressive diminution. I won't play that, but I will play again this moment when 3 layers of the theme appear one above another. So there's this theme pum 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 in what is it, quavers. This is semiquavers, and this is kind of demi-semiquavers motif, which is linked to it. So there is this kind of multi-layered mechanical revolving kaleidoscopic image produced. For the rest. And ultimately, it becomes kind of liquidated. Where this leads is a moment of a total breakdown, like a meltdown situation, as if you dance yourself into unconsciousness. And then is an interlude, which is dreamlike, very lyrical, quoting a Moravian folk song. It's not actually a folk song, it's Haas's setting of a folk-like text. Anyway, this incongruity is established, and I will come back to that. So my argument is that the Wild Night is actually a carnival night. It's directly inspired by this eccentric carnival of artists. And it's this hyperbole, this grotesque exaggeration of bodily motion, which is deliriously irrational. And it's a conflation of different styles. It conflates like social, cultural contexts like the primitive East and the exotic West and old-fashioned urban culture. And it's essentially, in some way, linked to poetism. I'm running horribly out of time. So this is another example from Haas's suite for piano from 1935, called Danza. And this is essentially, I would argue, a ragtime. It's played unnecessarily fast. Again, it kind of spirals out of control towards its end. And what emerges is a pastoral. It's actually called the pastoral. And again, it's an episode which is kind of in the middle, which comes in this moment of total delirium. And it's followed by a dance which is very much related to the ragtime dance, but it's much more dysphoric, I would argue. So it's grotesque-like, it's clownish, it's kind of strange, it's got all of these chromaticisms, and it also appears in a kind of frantic culmination. So but you know, still we can see kind of the link to poetism, but then comes the war. And Haas composes a symphony in 1941, still in Brno, not yet in Terezin, but already feeling the repression which came with the Nazis. And he, in the first movement, he has all these patriotic references to the St. Wenceslas chorale and the Hussite chorale. But then he writes the second movement, which goes somewhat like this. There's something ominous, some kind of quaver steps with cross rhythms, which could be seen as an affinity with these eccentric dances, but there's something more sinister, which is reinforced by tritones. And kind of inhuman voices which are too high and too fast. And then we've got this march tune. Sorry, not yet. This was supposed to be the march tune. So is it a march of soldiers? Is it perhaps a march of comedians, possibly? Or is it a satirical portrayal of soldiers as comedians? We get the answer because in the next part of his symphony, he makes a quotation of the Horst Wessel lead, which is, you know, on the first page of the SS Liederbuch, even before the Deutschland über alles. So it appears in three guises. So there's some satirical distortion in the use of parallel fifths. And then it's made sound like a barrel organ tune, reinforcing the associations with the fairground. So again, there's this mechanical character associated with dancing dolls and whatever. And then it comes as sentimental dance tune, sorry. But you can hear superimposed over it. in this chilling, sugary, sentimental idiom, he finally reveals that this is a dance of death, that this is a totem dance, although it's not labeled as such. So again, this troping which I mentioned before between dance eccentric and dance macabre becomes apparent. I am going to run over because I cannot skip this one. I also heralded it in the morning session. So there's one last example I want to talk about, which is the 4 songs on Chinese poetry written in Terezin. So this is literally months before Haas was killed. And it starts with this idea fix of home. And we mentioned about doubles. I wrote a chapter about, doubles and the uncanny in this music. And it again comes with this circulatio figure. That emerges the vocal line. My vote is there. I'm sorry. So there is an obvious reference to lament. And as in Gretchen and in Spindade, I argue that this is ultimately an image of the mental processes of this person ruminating depressively on the idea of lost home. And I talked a lot about melancholy in my chapter on this. It's really puzzling, though, that the second movement uses this, I don't know, rather cheerful melody. I mean, there is something ominous in the bass, isn't there? But at the same time, there's this whistling figure. There's something in the text about, I find myself in a bamboo grove, I'm happy, I'm alone, and I'm just spontaneously whistling. So there is this strange juxtaposition between melancholy and joy. And it continues, because in the third song, we have the same 4-tone ostinato, but now in crotchet. So we are sinking deeper into our melancholy. And it starts with the image of moon rising from water, and that's why I mentioned mirroring. And you can see the mirroring in the pitch structure here with this mirroring dyads. And there's much more of it, but I didn't go into that. And then the last song is called Sleepless Night. And it's like a transition from this bluish melancholy into the yellowish joy. And in the process of the movement, there is a point of kind of modal clarification going to C major and rhythmic clarification, from which emerges this dance-like tune from the second song. And it ends with this la 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 la. Expression, again, spontaneous expression of joy. Now, what do you do with that? Is this ironic? Maybe. I mean, the juxtaposition is just unbearable, right? But what is the relationship between these two extremes, and why only these two extremes? And some people said that it's based on the linear, teleological trajectory leading from darkness to light. And I was like, no, it just doesn't hold water, does it? I think that actually it's circular, this cyclic temporality, which is linked to persistent stasis. What's important about the melancholic parts of the cycle, it's a stasis which cannot be broken and which reveals itself in the circulatio figure, which appears throughout these movements. So I think it's more like a sort of yin-yang relationship between these polar opposites. And really, if this is an image of a person somehow trapped in this place of death, it's an image of life in the middle of death, and also death in the middle of life, which I think makes it really existentially loaded and really touching. So that's my really quick flight through Pavel Haas. So my conclusion is, Haas was fascinated with jazz and popular dances, and we could talk about Stravinsky and Martineau and Hindemith and Schulhoff and these people, and talk about whether there actually is a topic of eccentric dances, perhaps linked to ragtimes, and we can talk about that later. He was also linked to avant-garde aesthetics. So if you ask me about what is the signified, in the 1920s, it would be poetism and this kind of utopist vision of that. There's definitely some troping going on between dance eccentric and dance macabre, and juxtaposition of incongruous elements, which also developed throughout Haas's career and carry different meanings. So thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions in the following 3 minutes, I'm happy to hear them.
Yes.
Who's first?
Oh,
You are. Thank you very much. You're really strikes a chord.
Yes.
Thank you very much for all the examples of music. I have a very simple question. I don't know a lot about Haas. He had any knowledge of the story of
Unknown.
Because the idea of the eccentric dance is very much an ethical term in the story process. I don't know if not whole body team about that. It's credited with the jazz. And this happened around 1950. And he had actually founded a jazz band called something like the first eccentric orchestra of the socialists.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Okay.
So just to say that the term, the concept of eccentric music, the eccentric dance was actually very widespread at the moment in the context. For instance, this guy Barnard, he worked closely with Firehall for a time as composer of stage music for Firehall studies, etc. So this really strikes me a very, very close connection with what showed us there.
We don't know that much, but we do know that actually Haas married a wife who got divorced from Roman Jakobson, and she was Russian. So there are some links, obviously, but they only got to know each other in the 1930s. If he didn't himself know Russian culture, then Tiger did. And people around Devyatsil were very much Marxist and Russian oriented, so they didn't know.
And is it a possibility that it was via the literary sources?
Yes.
I have in mind Julian Kupin and Commander group in Poland, and Julian Kupin was definitely inspired by the Zaruna Yazık and old Russian avant-garde. Is it possible that it was the literates that were inspired by Russian movements and then through the literary sources to show?
Yeah, I'm inclined to believe that literature actually played a more important role in bringing about these topics into music than other music. I can be positive about that, but I think that was the case.
The question whether this could be a musical purpose or not.
Yes.
In my mind, this would be a variant of certain dance, like you have an ironic or a parodic variant of a march in Mozart or in Mahler, or you have a circus music in Mahler's work all the time. So I would say this belongs to the semantic field. The melodic version of the carnival would belong to the semantic field of dance, and to the opposite of spirit and the opposite of the law. Is this diversion and inversion of the carnival. But I would be, not to call it properly, a variant. So what do we do with irony and parody? If they're not Topoi, I had to find I found the tone of the discourse to all this, which you can use, of course, to very talk also, very semantic.
I think
The talk, how you say something, also in speech, is very, very important. You say it in a certain way, it will be taken literally. And depending on your face and your attitude, the irony will shine through.
I've read S.T. Scheinberg, irony is a very important student. I think he calls it modes of semantic ambiguity. So I think that's her phrase. And that is useful, but what is its relationship to topics? Is a good question. I mean, maybe the element of irony with its musical signifiers could be a constitutive element of some topic or a variant, as you said, of a topic. Maybe I should call it ironic dances or caricature-like dances. Maybe it doesn't help.
Also the tone of music is a category that is very useful.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I would also have a question. Joan mentioned Mahler. I could not help thinking about Mahler when I listened to your presentation, and especially I could not help thinking of the way they both combine, let's say, high and low styles.
Yeah.
Is it something that maybe Haas could have learned from Mahler, or is it something embedded in, I don't know, Moravian musical street culture, or
And you
are
know,
there any?
and then there is the issue of Jewish humor.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I had someone mention to me a kind of festivity, maybe a mode of discourse in which in Jewish tradition people tell themselves like really serious stories in non-serious, like humorous way. And it's a thing which I've forgotten what it's called. But maybe that is somewhere in, you know, the Jewish culture, maybe family culture. I don't know. I guess that he would enjoy these things in Mahler. I know that he wrote a review of Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth. And what he highlighted as something particularly effective dramatically was the juxtaposition of something really banal and something really tragic. When they discover the corpse of the man whom they killed, and there is some really banal music coming over that. He thought this is really something. And he does that all the time. So that's what we know about his preferences.
Thank you, Martin. We go on with the next paper, Various Epithets, different frame, topic, and narrative in Time Teller's short poem Dawn.
So I hope you will forgive me if I read, because we are in a time issue maybe, and then I know that I will be faster. So the object of analysis is this particular piece, Quoit Dawn, which remains one of the most popular and performed works of Eino Elle, and probably one of the most recognizable and loved works of Estonian symphonic repertoire in general, still often being programmed by the National Symphonic Orchestra. Composed between 1915 and 18, orchestrated in 1920. It is a sort of germinal piece where many of the later tendencies of the composers are present, mixing of styles and experiments with form. It has further been said to be a watershed moment in Estonian symphonic music, as the title and work are prophetic and symbolic of the moment where conventional gives way to the unconventional, and formal narrative and significant elements of the piece to ambiguity. So musicologists in Estonia have compared this in effect to Debussy's Prélude l'après-midi d'une faune as a beginning of modernism proper. While the piece has been given due analytical attention by musicologists in Estonia, my focus will be immanent narrative and topical features of the work. Here I'm indebted to Byron Almen's synthetic monograph on structuralist narrative analysis, on numerous authors who have written on musical topoi, to Estonian music scholars who have written on Quoit and also marked on its elements of signification, and to fellow scholar from Tartu, Marina Krishakova, and her writings on narratology and narrative frame. Various dichotomies of this piece have been noted in analytical literature. Traditional and subversive aspects of form, designation of the piece as symphonic image and a poem. So which type of signification is taking place? Is it a pictorial image? Is it a narrative with a hidden program, perhaps? Further contrast between modal, static, and functional and progressing harmonic styles, which gain in importance later in the composer's style. All of these are important to the signification of the piece. It will be my further contention that another contrast in the piece are the contrast between various musical topoi, expectation and subversion, and the combination of two styles of musical signification hinted at earlier, that of topic and that of narrative. First, an introduction to the piece. It has no clear programmatic allusions other than the title. Eller's general opinion is that no specific program can ever be attributed to instrumental music. Yet he often makes allusive general remarks to the contents of his pieces. I claim that this is perhaps sort of insider knowledge on musical topoi and sort of their functioning as a general semantic framework. It is a relatively short monothematic work in A minor. The structure you can see here. It can be divided into 8 parts, which I will elaborate more on later. It could be seen as a variation on sonata form, particularly because of certain elements that tend to hint towards sonata form, but without a secondary theme or development properly. This being replaced in the 3rd and 4th part by a sort of episode. Its main theme, carried by an oboe solo, is one of the composer's most memorable and beloved themes, and so I will play it for you in its entirety, hopefully. Of particular interest in the theme is the modal harmonic character, with key center not being strongly emphasized. The dominant semi-tonicized. And the minor key, I would call it pastoral topical framework. Pastoral character is most exemplified in the main motifs of the main theme, which Estonian musicologists have analyzed into 2 parts. First, the ascending motif, forming an A7 minor triad, which can be linked to folkloristic examples of foreign music. And the second, a descending motif, which has been tied to a vocal genre called helletus, a shepherd's call song, used for calling the herd or other shepherds from great distances. These motifs must be indeed the carriers of narrative opposition and the primary material of the piece in general. Morphological and paradigmatic analysis has shown that almost every bar of the piece contains material derived from these 2 primary motifs, mirroring Sibelius's idea of organic development. Indeed, even the backing oscillating harmonic figure can be seen to be a derivation of submotive B of motive 1. Using the truncated version of Almen's narratological analysis here is very appealing. Put simply, we could say that the narrative trajectory depends on whether motivic contrast between 1st and 2nd motives overcome, or whether a new order is established by the second, we could call it the transgressive motive. Secondly, the topical implication of these motives are as if virtual resources which actualize throughout the narrative of the piece in its actantial dynamic development in various topics. Of particular narrative interest is the transformation of the heletus, the second motive, in the second section of the piece, in an appassionata style, characterized by soaring melodies and octaves, repeated chords and triplet figures, in modulating ascending sequences, and an evocation of romantic longing, desire, passion. This call, shepherd's call, is turned to a general affect. We'll play it a little bit for you. The second theme can be seen as functioning as a transitional theme in sonata form. It leads us eventually to 5 of 5 of the dominant. But the second theme in dominant never comes. Instead, there's a total cut in forward motion into the vague key area of maybe E flat major, a series of minor 7 chords, which end up in a G sharp minor 7 chord. After this sequence, forward motion atrophies even further. In the fourth, we suddenly hear in C major the proper topical character of motive 1, which really comes to the forefront as a bassoon solo evoked in a grand empty acoustic space. This figure unites both motives in a tetratonic scale that really now evokes pastoral horn music, and can be seen as a development or evocation of this hunting music topic, which has gained a generalized pastoral semantic field. Here, the two motives exist in harmony. Sorry. Can't seem to click on that. Yep. After this, we hear a repeat of the transitional modulating theme, eventually arriving at this 5/5 of F major, which occurs as the culmination. Here we have mainly the D motive in various transformed variants in a heroic, jubilant breakthrough. After which, we might conclude that this is tragic to transcendent expressive genre, as Hudson calls. But this turns out to be an illusion. Instead, in another very interesting moment in Dawn, the harmonies slowly shift, bass moves stepwise to the dominant and then down to E, and smoothly resolves back into A minor. But as is noted, without any cadence in A minor, the upper voices are already articulating an A minor triad when the bass surrounds the D. It's as if we have always been in A minor. The F major is revealed as illusory. Following Allmend's method, and finally, yes, we have the theme again with the second motive transposed. Now, this is the French horn. Now it resolves down to the tonic instead of the dominant. So following Allmend's method, we might arrive at the conclusive narrative schema of tragedy, with a few yet ultimately illusory attempts to overcome this initial tragic order via transgressions in the 4th and in the 6th section. B motive is not able to establish itself as a new paradigm. But this story, as simple as this, is it not a tad unconvincing? are we back where we began? As Gregory Carl has noted, recapitulations and other extended formal repetitions have posed a perennial dilemma for narrative and straight dramatic accounts of musical structure, because the architectonic requirements they satisfy in music, I'm sorry for the mistake, have no counterparts in narrative literature or drama. So I turn now to the experience of listening to Dawn, and the various ways it plays with conventional form expectations from the listener. In modern narratological studies that have gone through a cognitive and an activist turn, narrative is no longer seen merely as the logical structure of a text, as exemplified by Allman's use of Northrop Frye's narrative archetypes. Rather, narrative is seen as representational expression of general proto-narrativity inherent in human experience that transcends the boundary between fictional and non-fictional. Narrativization and narrative interpretation is thus a general pattern of perception, cognition, action, interpretation, a tendency to view the world as temporally linked, with symbolic representations being generalized and culturally shared forms of these vaguely referential, perceptual, imaginative fields. On this field also depends narrative interpretation. As Tim Ingalls puts it, stories are not pre-meant, rather they have to be placed on a personal horizon of meaning. And on a personal note, compare this to Jean-Jacques Mathieu, who says that meaning exists when an object is situated into a horizon, such as an individual's personal experience. Rather than logical structure, we should thus speak of narrative patterning, done by people as they experience events, fictional or otherwise. A particular quality of narrative in this view is a tension between predictability and surprise. The latter is in fact necessary for an effective narrative, which Kryshakova sees as a mechanism for generating and refining predictions and enhancing the ability to attention. Narrative texts are cognitive scaffolding, enabling us to play through drafts of experience to come in terms with time, as Levi-Strauss says. As such, all narrative exhibits tension between the desire to construct an overarching storyline that ties events together in a seamless explanatory framework, and the desire to capture the complexities of events experience, including haphazard details, uncertainties, and confusing sensibilities. The key term here is, for me, frame. From cognitive semantics, a general script, global pattern of conventionalized knowledge that stores recurrent experiences. We can say that frames govern predictability, unpredictability, with the unpredictable appearing only in the context of a frame. If narrative is a story of how a plan went wrong, as has been said, then Dawn's semiotic interest comes from interplay, subversion, and reorienting frames in its narrative course. So what are these frames actualized? Well, tentatively, I propose a few. Maybe intertextual frames, habits of interpreting the genre of symphonic poem, tragic to euphoric expressive genre. Sonata frame, which is used by Estonian musicologists in relation to this piece. The most obvious non-fictional frame being, well, embodied everyday experience of a teleological event, of an intensification of light, let's say, which this schema occurs in music numerous times, with perhaps the most obvious example being Strauss's Das Volk Zarathustra. But here in the upper right, we see Dawn's structure, which does contain a motion upwards in a general dynamic and level of intensity, but then ultimately is a curved shape. I suggest that, and interestingly, of course, the topical depiction of dawn or morning occurs in the place of least intensity in the middle, curiously enough. There's another way to phrase this problem. As Allman notes, topics and narratives signify differently. The first, statically, if broadly semantically speaking. The second, in dynamic temporal form. The first is presented in Dawn as a topical interlude of low intensity. The second curves around this event as a tragic narrative. If narrative in this view that I recounted is a story of and from, then these contrasts present a problem for the narrative patterning of the listener and can result in patterning that might try to account for these discrepancies between the narrative's immanent structure, topics, personal frames of reference, and the experience that is being referenced. The very problem becomes productive, of course, a means to generate new and even simultaneously contradictory interpretations. For example, we might not agree that this is indeed a tragic narrative. We can remain unconvinced by the coda to the extraordinary strong topical invocation of mourning and the culmination of the death major. This is to say, sorry, I missed this slide. This is to say, the plot generated by the interpretation of the story does not need to match the linear musical discourse. The first being the presumed causal structure of the events. Taking a linear approach, the middle sections are reduced, enclosed as episodes in a tragic narrative. But if we take pattern skew that shifts in music, tonality, tempo, affect, topic, can correspond to shifts in the level of discourse, then the shifts in the middle can give us a clue. The fourth section might be a different temporal discourse, a flashback, a flash forward, or reveal a different narrative register, an objective scene, as opposed to the internal struggle of a lyrical musical agent, which in a rather conventional way occurs in the rest of the piece. I propose a final hermeneutical possibility, taking this idea of both registral and discursive narrative shift. What if the dawn depicted here by a pastoral mourning topic is ever present? Instead of being a memory or an illusory episode, the piece could represent the fundamental divide between the natural realm depicted topically, existing in all its positivity, and the realm of the human psyche with its internal dissonances, lacks, striving, and the tension between presence and longing, here portrayed in the lyrical actorial material. Here, Eller might be narrativizing the highly modern view of the subject and their separation from the object, the world as is, nature towards which, as a transcendent goal, the romantic is ever striving forwards and never reaching, yet this nature is ever present as a transcendental condition of the subject, revealed by the unification of the two opposing motifs in the section. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Are there questions? Have you considered extending your analysis on other pieces that have to do with the morning and dawn and come up with a sort of vocabulary?
Not quite actually with the morning or dawn, but I find very similar patterns in other pieces by Eller.
Okay.
Which is, I didn't have time to get into this, but this sort of opposition between a romantic style and an impressionist style, which usually depicts nature in this work, is present in many of the following, and most particularly in Symphonic Legend, composed in 1923. There is this shift between sort of lyrical romantic style and the static impressionist style that do not ever seem to come together.
Excuse me if you hear me.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for your presentation. I liked it very much. I appreciate it very much. And I have a question. I don't understand your opposition between topic and narrative, but I don't understand because they are not in contradiction. There is no contradiction between topic and narrative. It depends of your concept of narrative, perhaps.
I suppose this is my sort of polemic here, that sometimes frames provided by topics, and in this case, the paratext dawn, can interfere with the general narrative structure immanent to the piece.
And
because the frames, as I discussed them here, it can also be a way of structuring something narratively.
And what do you mean by immanent narrative structure?
Oh, I just mean in the sense of as exemplified by Byron Allen's approach, that we are analyzing structural elements within the musical text and not the musical text as representing any extra musical program.
But there is a sense of narrative in music which consists in creating sequences of topics. Yes. In this sense, there is no contradiction. That.
I agree, but hopefully in this particular presentation, I gave a hint as to how topical reference and the ultimate narrative structure of the piece can come into some sort of conflict that might result in multiple readings of the work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please.
Yes, thank you. Really interesting. Unfortunately, I don't really know this piece, so maybe it's a little difficult for me to just get an entire sense. But I like the idea of frames very much, and I suppose in sort of normal narrative, in speech narrative, let's say, a shift of frame is, how can I put it, probably easy to spot. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you have an idea of how that shift of frame might be apparent within a musical work, or if it's necessary for it to be apparent for your argument.
I think it is apparent in particular this problematic third and fourth section, where the musical discourse in its teleological motion comes to a halt and invites the listener to ask the question, how does this fit into the general narrative, which seems to continue with the longing theme, just comes back with little to no interaction with the pastoral middle section.
Thank you, Carl.
Yeah.
Hello, Pedro. Hi.
Hi, I'm so sorry.
He will present the paper Musical Gestures and Topics in Portregation of Guitar Music, Analysis and Performance.
Is it screen?
Pedro, you should share your screen with us so we can.
Yes. Okay.
Best chair in the world. Best chair in the world.
Okay, so everybody's seeing and hearing?
Yes, we are.
Good, thank you. So my name is Pedro Lopes Batista, and I'm researching Jorge Peixinho's music, particularly his guitar works. While studying these works, some musical gestures and topics were found, motivating the present communication. The aim is to spread Jorge Peixinho's music and its rich gestural content, which seems to be of interest to the field of musical signification. First of all, I should mention that Jorge Peixinho was a Portuguese composer, pianist, and teacher from the second half of the 20th century. He studied composition with Artur Santos and Coronel de Vasconcelos, with Boris Porena and Goffredo Petrassi at the Academy of Santa Cecilia in Rome, and later with Luigi Nono, Pierre Boulez, and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. He founded the first Portuguese contemporary music ensemble, Grupo de Música Contemporânea de Lisboa, in 1970, being the pianist and later the conductor of the group. As for his guitar works, Peixinho composed 21 guitar works during a period of 23 years, from 1971 to 1994. The only work for solo guitar is L'Oiseau Lyre. The others were composed for diverse instrumental formations that also include the classical guitar. The 8 works in yellow are available at the Portuguese Music Research and Information Center. The 8 works in blue were accessed through SESEM, Sociology and Musical Aesthetics Study Center, and the 3 works in purple were provided by Grupo de Música Contemporânea de Lisboa. The 2 works in red have their status unknown, being currently lost or incomplete on the sources available, and so it wasn't possible to access them for this investigation. There is also a recent composition for solo guitar composed as an homage to Jorge Peixinho, which will also be used to illustrate musical gestures and topics. To find musical gestures in Peixinho's guitar music, there was a search also in his own piano recordings. There are 6 Jorge Peixinho piano recordings available at Grupo de Música Contemporânea de Lisboa YouTube channel. The first 5 recordings listed are from these CDs, Jorge Peixinho Música, published by Tecla and later by Gerson. The last recording, As Quatro Estações, doesn't belong to that CD. Through the analysis of these recordings, with the help of the software Sonic Visualizer, some reoccurring gestures were found. Then similar gestures were found also on Peixinho's guitar works, grounded on Peixinho's own interpretative options at the piano. So there were diverse reoccurring musical gestures found through Jorge Peixinho's guitar works. Some of those will be presented now. One of such musical gestures consists on an appoggiatura forte with register shift, which could be named 2-hit combo. This gesture consists on playing 2 blocks fast and fortissimo. This is clearly idiomatic for the piano, with each hand prepared over each block, allowing for intensity and velocity. Notice that Peixinho chose clusters for this gesture, with 3 notes on each block. Notice also that the gesture is descendant. Is sound being shared?
Yes.
Okay. The same gesture reappears now in forte fortissimo and with even more notes per block. Again, Peixinho uses clusters on both hands and a downward motion. On Peixinho's guitar works, examples were found of this kind of gesture. What's interesting is that Peixinho clearly adapted the gesture in order for it to become more idiomatic on the guitar. First of all, the number of notes on each block is greatly reduced to 2 notes on the first block and 1 note on the second block. Secondly, Peixinho chose open strings for the first block, allowing for a preparation of the whole gesture by the left hand. Thirdly, the cluster was used once again, but adapted to the characteristics of the guitar, on which the simultaneous cluster is not as immediate as on the piano. So Jorge Peixinho preceded the gesture by a horizontal cluster rather than the vertical cluster found on piano examples. These adaptations allow the guitarist to strive for the intensity and velocity found on Peixinho's piano recordings. The gesture is ascending, although the piano examples were descending. Another example where the cluster is not present, but the open string is used again on the first block, and the number of notes on each block is further reduced to 1 note per block. The direction is upward once again, and this observation suggests that Peixinho treats the same kind of gesture in different ways on piano and on guitar. Although many differences exist, an abstraction allows us to conceive all these examples as representative of the same 2-hit combo musical gesture. Another gesture consisting of decay and tremolo, which could be named phoenix. This gesture consists on a note that is articulated and heard decaying until almost disappearing. That's when the tremolo starts from a very subtle dynamic on the same note, creating the illusion of a note that almost dies but is reborn. That's why this gesture could be named phoenix, the mythical bird that is reborn from the ashes. This is another example. The E note is articulated simultaneously with a massive cluster in fortissimo. After the decay and gradual muting of the cluster, only few notes remain when the tremolo starts. Peixinho writes pianissimo and una corda, clearly searching for the most subtle dynamic possible, emphasizing the phoenix gesture. This gesture exists as well on the guitar works. In this example, D flat is articulated fortissimo, left decaying, and is reborn on a piano tremolo that brings the note back to fortissimo. What the piano recordings heard seem to propose is to wait for the almost complete vanishing of the note, starting the tremolo in a very subtle dynamic. As you may have noticed, the guitar is perhaps one of the best suited instruments for this gesture because it can create extreme pianissimos that are impossible on most instruments. Maybe that's why this gesture shows up through Peixinho's guitar works. On this example, the C sharp is articulated first as a harmonic. After the decay, the note is reborn through a tremolo pianissimo on the same pitch. In this example, the same gesture is orchestrated between the flute and the guitar. While the guitar provides the articulation of the G sharp and the tremolo in piano, the flute is charged with the decay of the same note. And in this excerpt, with soprano, the guitar has once again an harmonic that is reborn on a tremolo pianissimo. Simultaneously, there is an attack resonance and dynamic game happening between the soprano and the guitar. This example can be seen as a variation of the Phoenix gesture, since the tremolo has two notes instead of one. Nevertheless, the effect is quite clear, especially since on the first chord, the composer distinguishes between the eighth notes and the stemless bass note. The B flat isn't muted in order to hear its decay. After almost disappearing, the note is reborn, sharing the tremolo with another note. Music for Almada, Nome de Guerra, the first Peixinho's known guitar work, allows for this gesture as well. On the improvisation guidelines, Peixinho asks the guitarist for sounds with resonance and tremolo, always with free durations and possibility of crescendo and diminuendo. Well, that's all it takes to create the Phoenix gesture. As for how this gesture can be used in context, syntactics-wise, this example from a Peixinho homage for solo guitar presents the Phoenix gesture being used to clearly launch to similar motions. Another bird-related gesture can be seen as possessing a bird contour. It consists of three notes displaced in such a way that its contour vaguely resembles the simplified shape of a flying bird, or otherwise its inversion. Whether this resemblance was intentionally suggested by Peixinho or not, it is nevertheless observed, mainly on his piece L'Oiseau Lyre. The title of this work is French for lyrebird, a bird species which excels at mimicking sounds, including those produced by other birds, thus suggesting this connection. In this example, Peixinho achieves the inverted bird contour through the untuning and retuning of the open sixth string, after which a regular bird contour appears in harmonics. For Peixinho's homage, a similar bird contour was built with harmonic notes taken from Música em Água e Mármore. Regular and inverted bird contours, being based only on the juxtaposition of any two intervals in opposite directions, can be found fairly frequently. This example is actually filled with shapes of this kind, starting with a bird contour followed by a reiteration of its inversion. Peixinho can show a careful control of resonance and dampening, writing in detail when each sound should cease to exist. This gesture of extinguishing each sound with precision recalls a candle snuffer, aimed to put off only one candle at a time with spatial and temporal precision. This example clearly shows the extent of Peixinho's dampening conscious writing. On guitar, Peixinho can also be very detailed when it comes to notating resonance and dampening. This notation clearly shows this care, and it's interesting how Peixinho is reinforcing through dampening the effect that naturally occurs on the guitar, since its higher strings are likely to sustain less than its lower ones. In this homage, detailed sustain and dampening was on same occasions indicated as well as another reference to Jorge Peixinho. Here, all notes from a 6-note chord are dampened, except for one. In this example, the effect allows for a smoother linking of two highly contrasting sections. Another example of candle snuffer. There are unwritten dynamics applied to pitch, also known as Mountain's melody. Although Peixinho can be quite detailed on the dynamics written, he doesn't write a dynamic on every single note and certainly plays dynamics that are not written. What's interesting is that many of those unwritten dynamics played are organic, following, for example, a relationship between pitch dynamic based on an association between high pitch with forte and low pitch with piano. Notice the third measure of the right hand, where a crescendo is added on G, B flat, and F. On the last two measures of this example, the relationship between pitch and dynamic can be heard on the added crescendo. On the right hands, B, D, and A, a diminuendo from C to D flat on the left hand, and again a crescendo from G to F sharp also on the left hand. On these excerpts, the relationship between the intensity of each note is once again strongly associated with its pitch. When the same notes reappear in the recording, the same dynamic relationship remains, reinforcing its intentionality. The same relationship is clear in the unwritten crescendo applied to this arpeggio in an upward motion. In this guitar example, like the shown arpeggio found on the piano recording, it seems to make sense to play an added unwritten crescendo in order to emphasize the pitch rising and the tension building. Likewise, the piano recordings heard can inspire a stronger dynamic on the last note in this guitar intervention, emphasizing the pitch rising. Notice as well the exquisite effect used by Peixinho with the help of a tricot needle. There were found a pair of clear topics in Jorge Peixinho's music. One such topic is tango. In Jorge Peixinho's piece Red Sweet Tango, there is a clear evidence in the title, but also in the characteristic tango gestures present in this piano piece. The tango topic is clearly enunciated, although maintaining Peixinho's own language. The same occurs with another topic, waltz. In his piece Ciclovalsa, Portuguese for cycle waltz, Peixinho presents the time signature of a waltz, although there is no full score. Each instrument has its own parts, which can be freely overlaid. A Peixinho specially devised instrument is applied here, the velophone. It consists of a bicycle placed upside down, which wheels are put into motion. While spinning, its spokes are hit with a drumstick or beater in tempo with a waltz metric. The spinning wheels perfectly convey the cycle theme, symbolizing the waltz pattern that continuously repeats. Once again, this could be heard as a waltz. I'll show the example with the velophone in the middle. In this guitar homage to Jorge Peixinho, the waltz topic is reproduced based on the guitar part from Ciclo Valsa, although the perception of metric is intentionally disrupted. And that's what I wanted to share with you today through this communication. I thank you so much for your attention and for the wonderful opportunity to participate in ICMS. And I hope that this could interest you into further exploring Jorge Peixinho's music, also in the field of musical signification. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. If there are questions, audience? Joan?
Can you hear me from here?
Maybe you should.
Oh, hi.
Hi. First of all, I want to congratulate you on this great effort, analyzing this music so thoroughly, and also for the playing that I enjoyed very much. Now,
thank you.
And also, I like very much the way you interpret iconically and symbolically some of the gestures here. What I miss, if I may say, is the rhetorical part. If, for instance, when you analyze this gesture from down to the top, this appoggiatura from down, this is, I think, in the first place, above all, a rhetorical gesture, maybe imitating some traditional genre such as fado, or you know, many traditional singers do that gesture. They take the voice from deep down to the top of the register in a kind of a moaning gesture, very, very expressive. How does that feel to you?
Yes, I think that's terribly interesting, and I would love to find a connection like that. I really didn't find, so I couldn't present it, but it would be really interesting to find such a connection between Jorge Peixinho's music and something traditional, which can be found sometimes, like in themes he uses in another pieces. But in this gesture, well, it has yet to be researched. My main focus and my main aim with this communication was really to present all of you, the community that is actively researching musical significance, I would like to interest you in studying Jorge Peixinho, because I feel that his music is so rich in gestural content. Yes.
Yes, Marta.
Yes. Hello. I would like to ask something about. No, I'm sorry. I had to change the
yes.
listening way. Thank you very much for this presentation. I enjoyed it really very much and appreciate very much. And I would just mention a Hungarian composer, György Kurták, who has published about 7 volumes of a series which is called játékok, games in English. It is a kind of in pedagogical introduction in contemporary piano music. And what is very interesting that your categories can be found absolutely in Kurtág's játékok. These little gestures, these basic gestures, they are his point of departure for his pieces. And it can be interesting for you to find it, to compare your terminology for the gestures with his terminology. And I would mention that I think that Joan is right also, because when a gesture is more complete, it goes where the rhetorical figures. For example, when you showed something which for me can signify also a basic rhetorical gesture in the history of music, which is very simply question and answer. But this is a basic figure because it is used from the Baroque or I don't know, for the medieval music, from the Baroque until contemporary music, notably Kurtág himself, but in another way, as of course in another way as other composers. But I don't want to go further, but I can advise you to look at játékok, games of Kurtág, from the first volume, because every volume becomes a little more complete, more complex, not complicated, but the organization of pieces are more complex. The first volume until the third volume contains the basic gestures. It can be perhaps, and there is another other idea that I had, because Costin Miranu, I think he was in connection with the Pescinho, the composer, Romanian composer, but French also. And I think that there was some connections. And I would like to mention that Costin Miranu has published a book about main gestures. It is my terminology, but the book is about main basic construction in contemporary music. It is in French, but it can be helpful also for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your advice. I will look into it, certainly. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there other questions? No, then thank you, Pedro.
Thank you so much. Sorry for being late.
No.
Thank you.